Hello, my name's Chris Rollison and I'd like to introduce you to Better Beetles. Better Beetles is a video that's been produced to help the Beetle owner and Beetle enthusiast to get along better with his motorcar. You may, like me, have found that garages are most reluctant to work on a vehicle as old as these are. And again, you may have been turned off by the high quotations that you've been getting for doing various items on the car. This video, the body video, is one that we've decided to produce. We have produced before an engine video, and a great many of those people who have bought a copy have written to us to say how enthralled they were with the video and would like to know more about their pride and joy. Now, the Beetle is a motor car that is actually increasing in value. Why? I don't know. It's a vogue, and a great many youngsters want to have a Beetle. Now, there are, I must warn you, out on the streets today, a great many ready to exploit the unsuspecting. Some of the tricks that they get up to, you'd be amazed. I have had a great many vehicles to look at over the last few years, and I have been horrified at what I have found. Now, you've each been supplied with a copy of my new 10 Commandments. Now, these 10 Commandments, of course, can be used for any motor car, but they are specifically designed for a Beetle. And I would like to do two things. To go through those 10 Commandments and explain more fully what they mean, and also to show you round a Beetle. You may be one of those who already own a Beetle. So some of these examples of what I'm about to show you, you could do on your own car. And then if there are problems, you can have them fixed before the next MOT. Now, I must say from the onset that this video is not a replacement for the workshop manual. You will need one of those for the year of manufacture of your car to remove ancillaries. These ancillaries will have to be removed to get to certain aspects of the body. This first part of the video is a compilation of films taken over a few months. These compilations are from different vehicles, so don't be surprised if the vehicle that we're looking at suddenly changes colour. This is to give you a wide variety of bodies and body shapes. First, take a small screwdriver. And don't be afraid to get the overalls on and have a look underneath. Have a poke with the screwdriver along the sills. Now, there's no need to apply great pressure, but if the screwdriver does pop through, you know you've got a problem. Also check underneath the rear wheel arches at the inner fitch plates. See if there's no problem there. Make a check of the bumper mounting brackets. Make sure that none of those have corroded. And do the front ones and the back ones. Take out the spare wheel and have a check on the inside of the wheel well and also the bumper bar brackets. Now, on this particular vehicle we can see it's got major problems, and on the other side we can see that it has at some time a front end shunt. Don't be afraid to tease back the carpets and poke with the screwdriver on the inner sill all the way along. This is one of the places that Beetles are prone to rot, and it's major repairs to put them straight. And a real must, you must remove the rear seat squab. and have a look round underneath there. Probe with the screwdriver on the floor pan around the battery. Over the years, battery acid could have been spilt, and battery acid's a good corroder of metal. And if you're in doubt, take the battery out and inspect. Make a check of the sills. Do both sides. And also on this rear step. Do go along there and tease back the carpets on the back panels. Probe along the bottoms of doors. And no matter how much the vendor protests, pull off the inner panels on the doors and have a good look inside there. Make sure that there's not too much rust. The door panel, of course, will soon pop on again. Second, take a magnet. Now on this rear side panel, there appears to be no rot, apart from a small crack towards the bottom. Now it appears to be quite firm. Let's put it on a magnet. Now that is all filler for a huge area, and I can assure you it's a very strong magnet. Now on models with this half moon vent, this panel here is also subject to rot. This one appears to be all metal. Above the drain rail is also subject to rot, and it's quite easy to fill in with filler. So use the magnet again. Between the bonnet and the windscreen is also another area to suspect. Between the lower door hinge and the front wing is also another area subject to rot, and we can see with the magnet that a great amount of that is pure filler. In fact, just below the magnet you can see where the filler starts. Now after a couple of good door slams, that section will probably drop out, and that section of door post with the hinge on will break away, leaving you with quite major problems. Third, take a friend. Now a friend isn't interested in buying the vehicle, and he's not interested in selling it. And he, being unbiased, may find points that you overlook in your eagerness to buy the vehicle. Always see the car at the vendor's house. Now if you have a problem, you can always take it back and try and get compensation. If you see it at the local pub, you don't know where the person lives. Very often these cars are quite dodgy. Beware of recent resprays. Now a coat of paint can hide a multitude of sins, and you'll be amazed at what's been covered over. Beware of recently renewed underseal. Don't be afraid to get underneath and have a poke round. You'll be amazed to find what underseal will cover as well. Do also check the logbook. Make sure that the serial number corresponds to that of the car and the documents. If it doesn't, there's a chance that the documents or the car could be stolen. Make sure that the engine number matches up with the ones in the documents. Very often you think you're buying a 1600cc vehicle to find out later that it's only got a 1200cc engine. You've been conned. After checking the engine number, have a look at the oil filler cap. And if it's got this white foam inside, this foam tells you that the engine is pretty well shot, because the piston rings are obviously badly worn. That means that the sump pressure is too high, whipping this sump oil into a foam. And of course the engine will have to be replaced or worked on very soon. Check that the registration number matches the year of manufacture of the Beetle. Now, for the novice, that may be rather difficult, but there are 4 distinct body shapes. Now, if you get it wrong, when you come to buy spares for it later on, you'll have all sorts of trouble. And the year to avoid is 1967. 1967 was the year that Volkswagen changed from 6 volt to 12 volt, and they didn't know which parts were going on vehicles. And finally, don't take an MOT test certificate as being proof that the car is in good condition. The MOT certificate is only good until the car leaves the garage that the vehicle was MOT'd at. And always take the car for a test drive. Now, if there's problems with the engine or brakes or steering, those can be renewed at a cost but fairly easily, because of course all these are unboltable. Now, if you've got problems with the body, that's another matter, and you'll find it very expensive to have those body parts repaired. Now, in this next chapter, we're going to show you body parts that can be replaced. Now, a company we'd like to promote in this video is Discount Body Panels at Bearwood. Before you go there, of course, we recommend that you telephone them to see if they've got the parts in stock. Now, if they haven't got the parts in stock, they can usually get them within 24 hours, and you'll find them most accommodating.
No problems fixing, rather than putting all the additional bits.
Yeah.
And at the moment we tend to find that these are the fastest selling item there. They're complete.
And the easiest thing to change on a Beetle are the wings. These front wings simply unbolt and bolt the new ones in place. These are the sloping headlight ones of pre-1967. Now, the other numbers, 95, 10, 31, relate to the part number. The 1 and 2 at the end relate to offside and near side. When it comes to Beetles with upright headlights, there are a great range of those. So you'll really need to know the year of manufacture of your motor car. And I hope it goes without saying, don't forget to remove the headlamps, and don't forget to give the wing bolts a liberal coating of oil before you start to undo them. You'll find the job is fairly simple. Now, this car of course will require a front panel or front balance, and there are a great range of those as well. So again, do find out the year of your motor car. And the first thing you'll have to do is remove the bonnet latch plate. And keep that safe. I was able to loosen the front 5 bolts on this side, but on this side somebody has welded the wing to the body, so that's going to have to be a grinding tool job. But before you do that, you'll need to make a line as to where you to cut. Lay on a straight edge and with a felt tip pen just mark along there. make sure that the line is just inside the panel. Now I should warn you that there are two types of discs. They may look the same, but one is thin, one is thick. The thicker one is for grinding and the thinner one is for cutting. Now you must use eye protection for this job. Cut down the panel completely, both sides. Having cut down each side, you can pull it forward. And very often when you do this job, you pull the panel forward, the paint and under seal will split, giving you a good line to follow. And with two hammers you can straighten out any deformity. Now if any of the side panels have been deformed, you can pull that out with a strong piece of wood and a good strong pivot point. When it comes to rear panels, discount body panels only do two, and for Super Beetles you'll have to go to a VW agency only. When it comes to rear wings, there's quite a few numbers to go at. These relate to all different styles, and they're quite easy to take off and replace. When it comes to front bumper bar mounting brackets, there are a whole selection there for you to choose from. There are some small panels and large panels, depending on how much rot or how much crumple you've got on those brackets. When it comes to rear bumper bar mounting brackets, there are only two. These cover all years, and you can have a large one or a small one. Inner wing panels come in two sorts, and they cover all years. Front inner wing panels, and there are only two of those, and they cover all years as well. When it comes to petrol tanks, discount body panels only supply two. The third one with the filler cap underneath the bonnet, they don't supply that. When it comes to sills, you'll need to know how sills are made up. First, in the centre, is the heater tube. And then there's the lower sill. And there's the upper sill. These are then spot welded at this point to make a strong, integral unit. And if you're contemplating fitting a complete sill, here are the numbers. But there are a wide selection of plates that you can acquire. This one is for the bottom sill. This is the one I prefer, but you do have to separate the body from the floor pan before you can fit it. It is then sandwiched between the floor pan and the sill and bolted through at this point. It then has to be welded at this point, either by spot welding through the flanges or by arc or CO2 welding at the side of the flanges. A second bottom plate that you can acquire is this one, but it's one I'm not too keen on using because it requires that you weld it on at these 2 points, which means that you will be fixing the body to the floor pan. Now if there is a problem later, of course that's going to be a great hindrance. For the side sill or running board fixing plate, you can use this one. Now that runs the length of the running board and also laps over the doorstep. For the inner sill you will require this plate. And for the upper sill, which only runs the width of the door, you will require this section. Another area prone to rot on a Beetle is the lower door plate or hinge piece. For that you'll require this part. Now if you have corrosion on this small piece just behind the front wing, a small section can be acquired, and here's the number for that. Now if the corrosion extends to under the front wing, a larger plate can be acquired, and here's the number for that. For bonnets there are only 2 styles, one for the standard Beetle and one for the Super Beetle. To cover side plates there is the small panel and the larger panel, and here are the numbers for those. And for floor pans you can either use the full size or 2 1/2-quarters. These cover all the years except for Super Beetles. With Super Beetles these panels have to be extensively modified. And because battery trays are subject to rot, there is a small panel that can be inserted in the floor pan. And there are a great many more body parts and sections that you can acquire. Now if you live a bit outside of the West Midlands conurbation, you will have to find your own body parts outlet. Now all the numbers mentioned in this video belong to a company called Beng, and they're the manufacturers. So you shouldn't have any problems when you go to your own body parts outlet. Now for those of you who are skilled and practical, there are some sections of course that you can make yourself, and we shall be showing you how to do those in the next chapter. Now in this next chapter, which we're going to subdivide again, you'll need to know what tools and equipment you'll require for doing your body parts. Of course the first thing is measuring, and of course you'll need a couple of rulers, and also you'll find very useful a tape measure, because of course a tape measure will wrap round fairly sharp corners. You will also find very useful a pair of calipers where you can mark out radiuses. Also a set square is very useful, and one of these multi-angle set squares which you can of course adjust to pretty well any angle you require. Now for the marking of metals you can get away with an ordinary pencil. That leaves quite a nice line, except it does have a tendency to rub off if you handle the material. Next of course You could use a felt tip pen, and that makes quite a good line. The only thing about this line is that it is rather thick to be accurate. Best of all, of course, is a scriber. Now that will leave a really crisp line that's very accurate and of course won't rub off if you handle the material a lot. And of course compasses. And that too will also give you a crisp line to follow. Now for cutting the material that you're going to be using, you could use a hacksaw, large or a small one, a pad saw, or a set of tin snips. Now these flat ones are very good for cutting straight edges, and if you need to cut round corners, use these. These are called gilbows, and of course to take off any burrs, a file. Now when you cut, don't cut right to the very tip of the cutters, because that will prevent you then having little notches all the way along the material. With the gilbows, as I said, you can then cut round corners quite successfully. And same again, don't go to the very tip of the cutters. And of course, do file off the burrs. Now when it comes to selecting the materials that you're going to be using, do try and assess the thickness of the material to be replaced. The reason for this is a multifold. Of course, first there's the strength of the material. If the material is, shall we say, 16 gauge, which is 064, or just under 1/16 of an inch thick, then do replace it with the material of the same size. And here's a graph showing you the thicknesses of metal used on Volkswagen Beetle motor cars over the years. 10 gauge 1.28 is just over 1/8 of an inch thick. So you haven't got access to a micrometer or a vernier, you can measure with an ordinary ruler. 16 gauge 0.064 is just over 1/16 of an inch, and so on. Because of course you will have problems with welding, and we shall show you about that later in the video. Also, there's strength, and from discount body panels or from your own particular body parts outlet, you can normally get quite large sheets of steel. They come in different sizes. This was 3x4 feet. You can get them in 4x1, 4x2 feet. Now, because this video is really for the dedicated amateur, the last thing we're going to be doing is hammering, say, a rear wing out of a piece of flat steel. But we can show you how to do simple sections that may not be on the list of body parts that you can buy. And now it's rather difficult to pass on to the amateur skills that I have picked up over a great many years. A lot of sections, of course, will be impossible to bend. So the easiest thing is to get a piece of cardboard and use solid board rather than corrugated board, and you can shape that round the parts, fold it and mark it out, and use that then as a template for when you're cutting the metal. The metal does cost money, obviously, and the last thing you want to do is try to cut out a shape that's impossible and waste the material. And with using card rather than paper, you can find out for yourself just how things will bend. Now this, you will notice, will be an impossible bend to do. You can bend it there, having bent it, you'll notice that the bottom has come out curved. Now unless you want a shape like that, if you want to try and keep it flat, it's not going to bend. So that would be an impossible shape, as I've just mentioned. And by delving into the world of origami, you can find that quite complicated shapes can be made up if the lines are straight. And this is a useful exercise for you to do before you start to tackle metal. Now when you've decided and cut out the parts that you want to replace, it's a good idea then to lay them out to find out what size material that you will need. And you can then of course measure them all and go away and order your metal. And of course it goes without saying, don't get the thicknesses mixed up. One of the more typical places on a Beetle, and this model is the Super Beetle, is a small patch below the rear seat. So first of all, cut out your template. Offer it up and see if you can press it into place. And that seems to be sitting down quite well. Now you'll have to transfer the shape to metal, and you can use for this an ordinary felt tip pen. And cut the shape out. Remembering that for curves, of course, gill bows must be used. And the next thing is to file this edge, all the burrs off there. Next you can mark out, usually with a dotted line, any folds that you want to do. And of course, having cut it and bent it, it may require a little bit more manipulation. But before you get to this stage, you'll need to know how to bend it. Now when it comes to metal bending or metal bashing, the dedicated amateur can use a great number of tools, certainly hammers. There are, of course, a great range of metal planishing tools. Unfortunately, these are very expensive and you probably will only use them once or twice. So I wouldn't go into the realms of buying any of those unless you're going to be doing it as a profession. Now the dedicated amateur can get away with a cross pane hammer, a ball pane hammer, or a mallet. This one has rubber ends to it, a lump hammer, And of course you'll need a couple of bending tools, and I've got here 2 pieces of sturdy angle iron and a single flat piece, fairly thick material. And also very useful will be a couple of G-clamps to use with your angle iron. With the material of course trapped inside. Or on the other hand, you may have access to a vise. Now when you start to bend the material over, don't bash it all the way down flat to start with, or else you'll end up with a curve. But go along it a bit at a time, going from one end of the material to the other. In a wave action. Then when you take it out, it will be nice and square all the way along. If you do fold it over flat to start off with, you'll end up with this side curved. And of course do try and get a small radius rather than a very sharp corner. If you try to achieve a very sharp corner, usually you'll end up cracking the metal on the outside. Now if you want to do more than one bend, then you can use this second piece of material. And of course you'll find that quite satisfactory. Now if it is necessary that you bend the curve, find out where the curve starts and put a mark on, and where it finishes and put a mark on. Then measure roughly in the centre and put another mark, halve it again, and you'll have to cut down each of those marks. And bend it over like an old threepenny piece. And by using this method you will achieve quite a nice curve. Now on this particular Beetle, for some unknown reason, a series of holes have appeared in the wing big enough to get your finger through. Now the easiest way to repair that is to fix on some of this perforated metal and then fill it in with body filler. The only problem with that is that you're likely to be doing the same job again in 1 or 2 years' time. The next easiest method is to change the whole wing completely. But the rest of the wing is in very good condition, so that's going to be expensive. Wings for this model are running at about £35, plus of course the dreaded VAT. But I'm going to show you a method by which you can use to repair those holes. Now the problem with the wing at this point is that it has a double curve, one this way and one this way. But I can show you better on a drawing. First, starting with a flat sheet of steel, we can see the shape that we need to end up with. But before you start to bend this shape, there's some preparation work to be done. And that is, the rust that's in the wing now needs to be cut out. And with the aid of one of these hole cutting saws, drill a hole just above this rusty area and one just below it. Loop the two holes together with a line. And cut along with the gilbows and file off any burrs. Next you'll have to measure the hole that you've created, and I find that this hole is 6 by 2 inches. But the piece I'm going to measure now, I'm going to make it 7 by 3, working on the premise that it's easier to cut a piece off than add a piece on. And we can cut that out. And in the centre there, I'm going to draw a series of ovals. The reason for these ovals is that we need an elongated shape when we finish. Now by using a ball peen hammer just in the centre target. Now this makes the centre of the metal greater than the outside allows to go. So to turn it over, we find a small bulge developing. Next, hit in the centre, line at the target, keep going round and round and round. And when we turn it over, we find that our bulge has developed even greater. Now hammer in the outside of the target. Moving constantly all the time, the metal between the anvil and the hammer. And we can see quite a nice shape forming already, both in the length and in the width. And of course, every so often during your metal planishing process, do go out and have a check on the vehicle so you don't go too much with your shape. When you're happy with your shape, put the metal underneath the wing, making sure that you've covered the hole, and then you can draw around the hole that you've cut out with a pencil. And of course cut it out using gilbows. It may of course require a little bit of filing just to finish it off and make it a perfect fit. Now, having marked out the panels that you want to cut out on your material, if you find there's any excess, then do use a small portion of that to try out your metal bending techniques. Now the next chapter is preparation. Now, nothing vexes me more than having to do a job that was done just a couple of years ago, and usually by professionals. Garages, of course, are looking to do the work in 2 to 3 years' time, so they have a tendency to put a piece of bare metal over rust. Now, nothing travels faster than rust to a piece of unprimed metal, and there are on the market today a great many paints that you can use, such things as calcium plumbate or zinc primate. The good one is aluminium paint, because of course aluminium is not subject to rust, so the barrier is extremely good. Ordinary household paint as well will act as a fairly good rust barrier. But none of these paints are going to be effective if you paint over flakes of rust, so those will have to be removed before you apply any sort of paint. But the most effective way to stop the transfer of rust is to remove it altogether. So with cutters or an angle grinder, grind it away. And then, with whatever sort of paint you prefer to use, give it a liberal coat of paint. Now, I prefer calcium plumbate. Paint both the body and the back of the part that you're going to fit. It really only takes a couple of minutes, but it will protect your metal for many more years longer than if you use them without painting. Before you start welding on the car, disconnect the battery. I prefer to remove it altogether because that will prevent an electrical fire if you burn through the cables, and also to prevent battery acid fumes from igniting. Now, if you're going to be welding towards the front of the car, it's best as well to remove the petrol tank. Mind your head. And always check at the back of the panel that you're about to weld onto and prise back any pipes or electric cables. And these precautions must be taken for your own benefit before you start welding. And we shall be showing you how to weld in the next chapter. Now when it comes to welding, there are three systems. First of all, there's oxyacetylene, but a great many hire shops of course don't have oxyacetylene to hire out. So the next thing is arc welding, and you can usually get one of these small sets of arc welders. They're not very expensive. Now when I say small, I don't mean small in stature, but a great many of them will go down to 20 amps. And of course you can buy welding rods in packs of 10. I would recommend 2.5 or 1.6. 2.5 would be for floor pans and structural framework, and 1.6 for body panels. So what you're most likely to get from hire shops are these MIG welders. MIG welders are very clean and very quick. Now the first thing you'll want to know is how to set them up. Well, the hire shop will tell you most of the things on there, but I'd like to go through this particular model so you can understand. First of all, of course, there's the gas, most of which is argon, which is a truly inert gas, and it's used for aluminium. But for welding mild steel, you'll need a mixture of gases, argon and carbon dioxide, or CO2. So instead of calling it MIG welding, we should call it MAG welding, metal active gas. For aluminium you must use argon only. For mild steel you can use CO2 or argon and CO2 mixture. And for stainless steel, argon oxygen or argon CO2. And the capacity that's in these cylinders will probably do most of the work that you want to do on your vehicle. Because I do a lot of work on vehicles, I go for this medium-sized cylinder. Now to connect it up, just push the pipe into the outlet pipe. Pull it back to make sure it is perfectly secure. And if you want to release it again, you have to press this small cap at the top and the pipe will pop out. Then turn on the gas valve, and by squeezing the trigger and listening at the nozzle, you'll hear the gas come out. And the next thing to do, of course, is to check that there's some wire on the spool. There probably will be a spool of wire on there, but if during your welding you need to change it, here's what to do. Put on the spool of wire, and the spool of wire comes off clockwise. There's a spring to go on and a wing nut. Now this wants to go on to apply a little bit of pressure to stop the spool from spinning too fast. Next, unhook the wire end from the spool and snip off the ragged part. Then you have to feed it through this small tube for quite a long way. By loosening off this spring, you can separate the drive rollers. Make sure that the wire fits in the groove, and we can close down the clamp and tighten it up. Next, unscrew the gas nozzle of the gun and also the wire feed nozzle. Plug in the welder and switch the set on. Turn the wire feed dial till it's about halfway round, and by squeezing the trigger we can apply pressure to this top spring, just enough to carry it through. And always snip off the end. Put on the wire nozzle and the gas nozzle. Replace the side plate. Now if the dedicated amateur's garage is anything like mine, it's probably full of inflammable chemicals such as petrol or paint thinners, and they'll have to be removed before you start welding. For your own safety, the next thing you'll have to consider is the clothes that you're wearing. Now these overalls that I've got on are a nylon base, so I shall need to change to a cotton set, and I could do that by the magic of television. And make sure that you do them right up to the neck. And the next thing you'll have to consider is the head, and any sort of cap or hat will give you protection from the sparks setting fire to your hair. It doesn't look very handsome, but at least it's a good protection. Gloves now. These short gloves, of course, will leave the wrists exposed. So, a good tip, pull the sleeves down over the ends of the gloves and put on a strong elastic band, and that'll hold it nice and tight. But best of all, of course, are these asbestos gauntlet gloves. And finally, there's the face. The high intensity light given off from the arc will give you a very bad dose of sunburn. So, a head mask. Now those are the most ideal, because for the novice to use a gun one-handed is very remote. He has a tendency to shake a little bit, so you can always steady your one hand with the second hand. One of these masks is most ideal. Make sure that the welding return, earth as it's sometimes called, is fixed securely to the metal bench. And practice with the gun a few sweeps, angling the gun over so you can see the arc. Now practice this for quite a few times. Until you get a nice steady movement, trying to keep the gun at the same angle and at the same speed and the same distance from the metal. Practice holding the gun at about 70 degrees from the weld surface. That will give you a good weld and also enable you to see where you're welding. Lift the gun about 5 millimeters from the plate at a 90-degree angle. When you feel you've got it right, then practice with the gloves on. You'll find it's quite different. Now, before you start to weld on your motor car, do use one or two offcuts from the metal that you have bought and have a practice weld. Sit one piece of metal on top of another so that there's a slight air gap, and that'll prevent you from welding the metal to the workbench. Now there are a wide variety of sets that you can hire, and they all should be supplied with a set of instructions. First of all, switch on the power. Turn the wire speed knob till about halfway and set to the minimum amperage. And turn on the gas valve. Now before you start welding, always try and remember to snip off the tiny bit at the end of the wire. That'll make it a lot easier for you for when you start welding. Aim the gun at the metal, pull the mask down and gently squeeze the trigger. Now this is what you should be seeing through the mask. Also listen to the sound of it. It should be a crisp, even crackle. Try to lie down 2 inches of weld. Now to finish welding, just release the trigger slowly. And take a look at the weld. The brown deposit that we can see on there is oxide, and that's due to chemical reaction. But your bead of weld should be straight and even. Now if you want to check on your welding technique, the easiest thing is to saw through at this point. And the shape of your bead should be nice and smooth with the edges melded into the metal. If you've got everything perfect. But your first efforts will probably look like this. So if we sawed through at this point, we'll be able to see that the weld has not melted into the steel plate, but it's just resting on the surface, and that's a bad weld. And again you might have a weld like this, which is very flat. Now if we turn it over, we can see it has a bulge on the other side of the metal as well. So if we sawed through at this point, we would have a shape like this. Now the problem with this sort of a weld is you're likely to burn a hole in the metal. Let's have a look at the 3 shapes together, and we can see you've got a 2-to-1 chance of getting it wrong. Now it may be that you're pointing the gun at the wrong angle, or at the wire speed or amperage is incorrectly set. So you may have to increase or decrease your wire feed speed, or you may have to increase or decrease the amperage in line with the maker's instructions. But keep practicing until you get it perfect. Now that you've got that right, we can do a proper weld. And there are a great many welds to be done on a Beetle, depending on which corner you're working on or which section. So I'm going to be showing you a series of welds which you can do for your motorcar. The most common weld that you will be doing is what I call a long lap weld. And in diagrammatical terms, it looks like this, with one sheet of steel overlapping another. Now I've designated this type of weld as being number 1, it being the most common that you will use. One minor problem that you will have with this type of weld is how do you clamp it in place while you're welding, especially in places like under the wing, for example. Now for when you're welding on the motor car, here's a simple tip. Have a piece of wood, it really doesn't matter how big it is, but have it just short of your arm's length. So you can lean on the piece that you're about to weld and then use 2 hands to weld round the plate. And you'll find that's most beneficial. Now aim the gun at 45 degrees with the wire directly into the corner. Press on your piece of wood to act as a clamp and weld at each end. Now if you misalign the gun, you're likely to end up with a weld like this. where the weld is only adhered to the upper plate, or alternatively where it is only adhered to the lower plate. So do practice to get this angle correct. Now you may have noticed when you did your long weld that when the metal cools it turns upwards, and this is due to contraction. Now to overcome this condition, after you've stitched at each end, tack in the centre, and then at the quarters, and then in between, allowing the metal to cool down each time before you start welding. Now the second most used weld on a Beetle is what I called the short lap weld, and you would weld it at this point. And I've designated this weld number 2. Unlike the long lap weld, this can be clamped either with G-clamps or mole grips. And for our third weld is what I call a T-butt weld. And again, you'll have to tack at each end, making sure that the wire is directly in the corner. And I've numbered this weld as being number 3. Now instead of tilting the metal over, leave it on the bench and angle the gun at 45 degrees and weld as before. Number 4 on our weld list is a corner butt, and for this one we have to take a little more care, because we have to leave a small gap between the pieces of the metal at this point here, roughly half the thickness, and this is to allow the correct penetration of the weld bead. Now if you have the gap too small, you'll get the weld bead sitting on the outside corner, leaving you with a rather weak joint. Alternatively, if you have the gap too wide, the metal will sag through at this point, leaving you with a really overcooked weld, and it will be brittle. So this is another good weld to practice on, and this is what it will look like underneath. Now to give yourself good welding practice, try tacking together 2 pieces of metal with a tapered gap, like this, and see just how you get on. Now starting at the narrow end, work as long as far as you can go. And eventually you'll come to a point where it's impossible to weld. So the gap at this point is very critical. Do try and get it half the metal thickness wide. Now if you do need to make a very strong corner, you'll have to do more than one weld. First weld will be directly in the corner. The second run of weld is aimed at the joint between the first bead of weld and the side plate. And the third run of weld will be on the opposite side, building up a strong bridge across the corner. The fifth weld I'd like to show you is a flat butt, and just like the corner butt, this also will require a gap between the elements. of approximately half the thickness of the metal to allow you, when you weld, to weld completely through the plate, giving a strong bond between the two pieces of metal. The sixth welding example is what I call combination, so that when you weld, it's a mixture of lap and butt weld, giving a very strong weld, and it's usually used for floor pans and load-bearing brackets. The last weld that I'm going to show you is called a pierce lap weld, and there is only one place on a Beetle that you will use it for, and that's the front bulkhead. But it really is a most common place for the body to rot. So I'm going to show you how to do that. I know there is a dedicated panel for doing front bulkheads, but if it's not a very big hole that you've got, then a simple cutout can be made and have a turn back on the end here to enable you to weld easily. Now, along the bottom of the plate, which would be a short lap weld, it's most difficult to get to, because normally there's the floor pan and also the tunnel of the floor pan, which is the backbone of the car. Now, on this particular example done by Bodgers, they have actually welded at this point. Now, this fixes the body to the floor pan, and the last thing I want to do is to encourage you to do a thing like that, because if you do need to take the body from the floor pan later in life, it becomes most difficult. So the thing to do is draw a line along the bottom edge of the plate around about half an inch from the base, and at every 3/4 of an inch put a cross mark on, and at each cross point you'll have to pierce a hole. Now, you can get from hire shops metal piercing tools, or on the other hand you could drill them out, and they need to be about 1/4 of an inch diameter. Then you would weld through the holes like a lap joint. And that's a simple answer to an age-old problem. Yes, it does take a little bit longer, but you'll be happier with the end results. Now, there is only the one place that you'll be using this type of weld, so we shan't be giving it a number. So, when you get your welding set from the hire shop, do you read any instructions that they will supply you with, especially any safety pamphlets? And do have a go at some welding on some of your offcuts, because of course welding is a skill that doesn't come easily to somebody that hasn't done it before. Now, all the examples of welding that you've seen on the video have been done with a MIG welder, but if it's not possible for some unknown reason for you not to be able to hire a MIG welder, then you'll have to hire the next best system, which is arc welding, and there are subtle differences. First of all, there's the intensity of the light. The MIG welder has a small electrode, so it has a small light, and the arc welder has a large electrode, so it has a large light. Now, although the intensities are the same, it would be the equivalent to, say, a side light on your motor car as compared to a headlamp. So the first thing you'll have to consider is the face mask and the filters that they contain. For MIG welding, you will need a glass filter number 8 or 9, and for arc welding you will need a glass filter number 13 or 14, depending on what colour eyes you've got, either blue or brown. So do get it right. Then there's starting the arc. With MIG welding you can actually touch the electrode to the metal before pressing the trigger. There is no power there. With arc welding there is power there, and you have to tap the electrode before you can achieve the arc and keep it maintained. The next thing that you'll have to consider is the angle of the electrode and the direction in which to travel. This is for horizontal welding. And for vertical welding, these are the correct angles and directions of travel. I would be inclined to use MIG welding for body repairs and arc welding for floor pans and structural repairs. With MIG welding, the arc is surrounded by an inert gas, carbon dioxide. I'm now going to demonstrate what it would look like if you ran out of gas mid-weld by getting somebody to turn the gas valve off. Now, this will result in heavy oxidization and spatter, which are beads of molten metal. Welding rods, on the other hand, are covered with this flux compound. And as it burns, it excludes oxygen from the weld in the same way as carbon dioxide does. But it does leave behind this deposit over the weld called slag. Now, if you've got your welding correct, it has a tendency to peel back, as this one has done. But a few taps with the hammer will get it loose, and finish off with a wire brush. And that will leave you with a nice clean weld. Now, the electrodes for arc welding are covered with this compound. And this compound is subject to damp. So put a selection of welding rods that you're likely to use under the grill for 5 minutes to help to dry them out. Now, although it would be perfectly alright for you to put an electrode into the clamp in the workshop without using a glove, if you were to do this, say, sitting inside the motor car, there's a chance that you'll complete the circuit and have an electric shock. So that's another reason why you should always wear gloves. Now, do try and remember our numbering system. It's so awkward for us to get cameras and welding equipment and lights into certain aspects of the car. So all we should be doing later in the video is putting up a number, and these numbers will correspond to the type of weld that we're doing on each section. And here's a reminder of what welds the numbers refer to. Now, in this next chapter, which we've entitled Why Oh Why and What Can I Do About It, we're going to be showing you some simple repairs that you can do on your motor car. These repairs are the first signs of your motor car rotting away. Now, because the youngest Beetle in this country that you're likely to find is at least 15 years old, the car I drive is 31 years old, so that says a lot for the longevity of the Beetle. And it's also safe to say that most of these vehicles will have rust on them, with the exception possibly of those cars that are kept in concourse conditions, and they only touch tarmac at the beginning or the end of car shows. So you have to go over them regularly, say every 6 months, and examine the paintwork minutely. Look out for these small bubbles that appear in the paintwork. Check first the drain rail on the roof, then just below the window on the top of the door. One of the first places to show rust is the 4th bolt up on the rear wing, and also just below the windscreen where the body meets the boot lid. And if these places are allowed to go unchecked and unattended to, you end up with a horrible mess like this door hinge, and also the bottom of doors. Now, there's nothing more boring than watching rust appear on your pride and joy. So with the aid of time-lapse photography, we can speed up this process. Here in January we see 2 small spots have appeared. In February they've been joined by a few more. March the process continues. In April they begin to join together. By May they become quite noticeable. In June the process continues. In July it's looking decidedly sad. In August we see rust appearing at the bottom of the door. In September not only has more rust appeared at the bottom of the door, but the original patch has grown bigger. In October it has pierced the metal, and we also see another patch higher up the door which is a stone chip, and that also is going rusty. In November the central patch has a small hole in it, and everything is beginning to look quite bad indeed. By December the constant closing and opening of the door has caused the line of rust to split. By January we can get through quite a big screwdriver. Now if this had been treated a year ago it would have saved all these problems. There are on the market today a great many compounds that you can buy for curing rust, but the one that I would recommend is Loctite Rust Remedy, and it's ideal for treating these small sections of rust that we can see on this door. First of all, burst the blister of paint. Sometimes you see a spot of water come out, but gently tease away the flaky paint until you can get down to the metal. Break off any loose rust and give the surface quite a good scratching. This small hole that I'm working on is actually pierced, and we can put the screwdriver through. And while you're at it, you can be doing the rest as well. When you've got all the loose paint off, then make sure that the spots are dry and free of dust. Then you can put on the Loctite Rust Remedy. But whatever you do, don't use the chemical directly from the container, but pour a small amount out onto a saucer or a glass dish. And then using a small paintbrush, I usually use one of my wife's old nail varnish brushes, but brush it on and leave it to dry off. Now after an hour a chemical reaction takes place and the colour changes from white to blue-black. This has reacted on the rust and chemically treated it. It has also covered the rust with a thin film of resin, and resin is impervious to water. And after the reaction has happened, then you can fill these areas with a small amount of body filler and coat them over with a touch of paint which you can get from any good auto accessory shop. But that's only treated half the problem, because the back of all the places that I've mentioned early in this chapter, there's been very, very little paint sprayed on by the manufacturer, and also they are water traps, as we can see inside the back of this door. For treating this kind of rust, then use Finnegan's wax oil. That's a great preservative and prevents your car from going rusty. Now the way to apply that is with the aid of one of these garden sprayers. Before you put the wax oil into the sprayer, of course, you have to warm it up to make the constituency very thin. But don't forget to remove the lid of the can while you're warming it up. And then it's a matter of pouring it in. And put your sprayer back into the warm water you've got to keep the constituency of the wax oil thin while you're spraying. Now, although the instructions say spray over all the rust, I like to remove as much rust as I possibly can. Using scraper or an old wood chisel is an ideal tool. Then I like to follow up with a vacuum cleaner to clean out all the debris that's fallen into the bottom of the door and all these inaccessible recesses. Now, if you're going to be doing a lot of wax oiling, then yes, do use the sprayer. If you've only got a small amount like this door, then alternatively you can apply it with a paintbrush. Put on as liberal coat as you possibly can. But for doing the tops of the doors just below the window, you'll have to use the sprayer. Now, we know it's very difficult to stop water from coming into the door, but a simple tip is let it out quicker by drilling 2 or 3 1/4-inch holes in the bottom of the door, and try to drill as close to the rubber as you possibly can. On drain rails, the corrosion usually starts on the passenger side because, of course, the car is always leaning that way because of the camber of the road. But a useful access point to that channel is behind the interior light, which is always on the passenger side. Now, do be careful not to earth out the live wire, but get the sprayer in there and waggle it about a bit. And of course, do go both ways with it as far as you possibly can, and that will help to protect everything in that channel. And don't forget to clip back in the interior light. Another useful access point is these half-moon covers. If your Beetle has one of those on, then remove those. They come out quite easily. And again, get the sprayer in there and spray as much in there as you possibly can. And it's very simple just to pop back in that cover. Now, for doing the inside of the rear wheel arches, you'll have to remove the seats and the side panels. And it also means you'll have to remove the rear seat rests. And get as far back as you can over the rear wheel arch and spray all the wing fixing areas. Spray also the top of the sill right into the corner where the door pillar is. Give it a nice thick layer of wax oil. And from inside the boot area, do the section underneath the front windscreen, right into the corner there. Another area that's a real must, you must tease back the carpets and remove these front covers to get to the hollow section in the front bulkhead, using whatever access holes you can find there. Give a liberal coating of spray to the inside, and do the same for the hollow section behind the pedal cluster. Now, although wax oil is perfectly good for all those internal panels, when you come to floor pans and the inside of wheel arches, then use underseal. I know there's a great many of you out there in TV land wanting to give me an argument about the qualities of underseal. Well, no matter how much you shout at the TV screen, I can't hear you. And yes, there are certain qualities to underseal which are undesirable, After a few years they dry out and they become flaky, forming pockets in the underseal which become water traps. So what I always do when I get a new tin of underseal is stir in some old engine oil. Now I can't tell you what quantities of underseal and oil to mix together because of course I don't know what sort of underseal you will be buying. There are different qualities. But if you said to yourself 10%, then that's probably near enough the ideal. Get that mixed in very thoroughly. Now what happens with this, the surface of the underseal will take much longer to dry out. Normally it takes about an hour before it becomes touch dry. And of course over the years the surface remains dry, but the layer of underseal between the surface and the car body remains tacky and tenacious, and of course it doesn't form these pockets of air. So that's a good solution to the argument of underseal. Now if your motor car has gone beyond these simple remedies, then you'll have to start replacing body parts and panels, and we shall be showing you that in the next chapter. Now if you're going beneath your motor car to take off old underseal and renew it, then do be sure you're safe and use recognised equipment to a good standard. Don't rely on just the car's jack, and don't rely on a trolley jack, no matter how good you think it is. Use wheel ramps or axle stands, and also eye protection. We don't want this to be a case of please don't talk about me, one eye's gone. Now we've reached a stage in the video where the dedicated amateur has to think. He has to think of two things. First of all, there's the equipment that he will require, and also the capabilities that he needs to do the job. First of all, there's the equipment. And a lot of things we saw in previous chapters, such things as hacksaws and tin snips, gill bows. Very useful you will find is a jigsaw or an angle grinder, and it's a little bit brutal but it does the job well, is a bolster chisel and quite a large hammer. Just a little bit more brutal than an air chisel and compressor, which are expensive to buy and not many hire shops will have them in stock. Now you will really need to assess your own skills, because if you start a project and are unable to finish it, then it's probably a scrap car or very, very expensive to put right. Think to yourself, how many adverts have I seen in the magazines which says part project for sale? Now in this chapter we're going to show you simple things first, leading up to the more difficult things. And I have to remind you again, don't be surprised if the colour of the car that we're working on has changed colour. We are able to film very often, and sometimes we're not, because the customer's in a rush and wants his car back. So do forgive us that one small point. My colleague and I over the years have done a great many Beetles, and we really do know what we're talking about. And one of the first places you'll probably get a problem with is sills, either through the MOT or the fact that the running board is flapping rather a lot. So we're going to do sills first. And having stripped off the running board, we can now see the unseen problem, and that really is quite a mess. First of all, find one good running board fixing screw and draw a line right up to the top of the sill, and use that as a gauge for when you refit the new part. The running board fixing plate has already got the captive nuts in place. Two things have to be done before you offer up the new plate. First of all, prise up the carpet fixing strip. Next, push out the captive nuts in the original plate. And make the hole big enough to accept the new nut. Now offer up the new panel to make sure that it's the correct one for your motorcar, and push it well into place. Now, nothing travels faster than rust from one piece of metal to another, so I like to cut out as much rust as possible using an angle grinder. First of all, cut along the lower flange, keeping the flange in place. Then, on the top edge, cut off as much rust as there is. Try and keep this top edge as neat as possible. Resting on this lower plate are all these flakes of rust, so get the vacuum cleaner in there and suck out all these pieces and all the debris that's fallen into the bottom. Next, give it a coat of paint. I've said before that I prefer calcium plumbate. You could, on the other hand, use zinc primate or an aluminium paint, and spread as thick a layer of paint as you possibly can, because the layer of paint that you're applying is more than the sill ever had, and I'll prove that to you later in the video. Refit the new running board fixing plate, making sure that the captive nut lines up with the line on the bodywork. Press it home and screw on a G-clamp, clamping the two flanges together. Also, as a clamp, you could use the welding return. Weld in the centre, just a good tack weld, and then weld at each end. Now turn back the rubber door seal to prevent a fire, and tack weld the top two corners. And when you've tack welded it on, go all the way around welding it to the body. When it comes to the undersill, and this one we can see is quite bad, then again you'll have to cut out as much as the panel as you can, still retaining as much of the original flange as you possibly can. And of course inside the still is still full of debris. So get the vacuum cleaner in there and suck it all out. Then give the interior of the sill a liberal coating of paint, and while it's drying off, start removing the floor pan to body fixing bolts. Now when you get your body panels from your body panels outlet, they are full size and usually have some excess material which you have to remove. Now the excess material that we have on this panel are the body nuts, and they will have to be removed. Now the easiest way to remove these nuts is trap the panel in a vise, and then with a good bolster chisel and a decent size hammer you can knock those off. and that leaves quite a decent size hole through which you can locate the body fixing bolts. And starting at the front end, locate it between the floor pan and the body. Knock it into place until it's flush. Put in all the floor bolts, but don't tighten them up until you've got them all in. Then clamp the flanges together and weld them as we showed you before. Now here's a really good example to show you just how bad a sill can get. There's nothing more to be done with this, but take it off, completely renew it. It really is a botched job. The upper sill looks like it's been sculpted out of body filler. These videos have been produced to help the Beetle owner and Beetle enthusiast to get along better with his motor car. But in changing the sills, which is probably the worst job on the Beetle, you'll have your patience and your skills levels tested to the limit. So do ask yourself, am I up to it? And ask yourself the same question again at the end of this section. You will also have to consider the amount of preparation work before you can start working on your sill. Remove all the interior upholstery and the battery. Also you'll have to take off the rear panels and the seat belt fixings. The door seal will have to be taken up at least 6 or 7 inches and stuck back with a piece of sticky tape to keep it out of the way. You will have to remove the petrol tank. Not only is it a fire hazard, but it'll help to lighten the body. And for ease of access, remove the front bumper bar and the front wing on the side you're going to be working on. And with the aid of an impact screwdriver, remove the doors and store it away safely. Next, measure the door aperture to the finest degree on your tape measure and measure at the top and the bottom. The side we're working on is the passenger side, and it really is the most awkward of the two because of the wiring loom. And here we can see the wiring loom actually goes through the sill. So you'll have to grind through the sill to release the wiring loom. Next, start to undo the body to floor pan fixing bolts. On all Beetles you'll have to remove this bolt between the body and the rear suspension. Use plenty of release oil. Now this is a very tough bolt and very often they shear off. So when you've got it loose, put on some more release oil. And take it out completely. Early Beetles have a bolt on this back step behind the rear seat, and that also needs to be removed. The 4 bolts across the rear A-frame also have to come out. On Super Beetles there are 2 bolts under the head frame to come out, and do give them a couple of taps with a hammer and plenty of release oil. With Super Beetles as well, there are these 2 bolts in the bottom of the spare wheel well. Now for standard Beetles and jeans Beetles, these 2 bolts are hidden under the front lip beneath the petrol tank, and they will have to be removed. and using whatever tools are available to you, cut away the old sill. When you cut through by the door pillars, then do cut at about 3/8 of an inch from the door pillars. This will enable you to keep as much of the flange as possible. There will be some brute force involved and sharp edges, so do wear some strong gloves. Break away the sill as easily as you can. Now you remember when I said about no paint in the sill? Well, here's the proof. This is absolutely bare metal. You'll find that quite big chunks will come off, and it will be a struggle at times, but keep at it. Things get worse before they get better. Once you've got the large pieces out, then work on the flanges round the door pillars and make them nice and neat. And do the same for this rear section. Break off the big pieces and make the flange neat. You will also have to remove all this mastic put on by the manufacturers, because if you try welding through it, you'll have great difficulty and it gives off terrible smells. Clean up all the flanges prior to welding. On Super Beetles there are these last two bolts that fit into the tunnel. Now we've left these in place during the sill removal process to keep things in line, but they will have to be removed. Now you'll have to clean off the flange of the floor pan with a wire brush or scrapers and give it a coat of paint. Now to replace the floor pan to body seal, which are about £17, here's a simple tip. Buy from any good auto accessory shop a flat floor mat for about £1.20. Cut it into 1¼ inch strips. One mat is enough to do both sides. Make sure the holes are in the right places and glue it to the floor pan. Then, with the aid of a couple of good toughies, one at the back and one at the front, lift the body. And you can offer in the sill. For ease of access, the front lip will have to be bent very slightly. Don't forget to fit on the tube to the heater and push it into place, and follow up with the back section. Make sure it's in line and you can set the body back down onto the sill. And after giving all the bolts a generous coating of copper slip, replace them into the body, into the chassis. This is just a reminder of where the bolts go. Don't forget. Now check that everything is in line. Go round all the joints, moving them about if necessary. You may have to slacken off one or two of the nuts and bolts to do this with. Make sure that all the flanges are down as low as possible in this front section as well. Remeasure the door aperture and get it correct. Measure the top and the bottom. You may have to move it about a little bit. You may have to reshape some of the flanges very slightly for them to meet together. And on this back section as well, some slight manipulation may be required. To recheck the door aperture, the easiest thing is to replace the door prior to welding. Fit all the screws in up to a good hand tight and try to close the door. Check on the gap, make sure that it is perfect all the way down. Check all round the door to make sure that the gaps are equal. Try opening and closing the door. Check on the waistline of the car, make sure that is perfect. Some slight adjustment to the door screws may be necessary. And when you're happy that everything is correct, preferably with the door closed, weld the door pillar to the sill. I suggest that you put on a good tack weld on the front pillar and on the rear pillar. Recheck the door again. Make sure that none of the gaps have closed up. And when you're completely happy, everything is set correctly, then continue to weld round the door pillars, and you'll use a combination of welds. You will probably use most of the welds on our weld list. Now that things are beginning to come together and we watch the final welding done, you'll have to ask yourself the all-important question: am I up to it? We suggest that you start with the more simpler things on your motor car. Now, for those of you who are fortunate or unfortunate enough to have the Carman Gear Cabriolet Beetle, then these corner gussets in the doorways will have to be taken off with extreme care and replaced. Now, when you take them off, do make a note of the positions and the angles that they're sitting at. This is very important that you save. They are irreplaceable. Beneath the door also is a strengthening beam. This also must be removed with extreme care, because if you damage it, you'll find it very hard and very expensive to replace. Now, having fitted your sill and checked it over, you'll probably find there's a hole underneath the door pillar, big enough to get a pencil in. Whatever you do, don't fill this in with weld, because of course it will act as a drainage hole. The backside panel, and this is the Carman Gear, will require some infill work towards the bottom. And during the chapter on metal bending, I actually showed you the piece that you'll require to do this job for you. And this is what it'll look like when it's fitted into place. But on the Gold Beetle, there's so much rot here that we shall be fitting a brand new panel, and we shall be showing you that later in the video. On the front inner wing there will also be some infill work to be done. Or on the other hand, as we can see on this example, you may be wondering why the passenger's feet are always cold and damp, usually the wife's. So, cut out all the old rust with either a jigsaw or an angle grinder or even gilbos. Make sure that it's not deformed. Press home any bends or anything like that. And you can offer in a new panel from your body panels outlet. Make sure it's the right one. Or if you fancy, you can make up one of your own. This is one of the easy panels to make. And don't forget to prepare and paint the panel before welding. Another area prone to rot is this rear inner wing panel, just above the suspension bracket. Now on this example that we're showing you, this panel looks in extremely good condition, but it is still an MOT failure, because this bottom lip, where the strength point is completely rotted away. And now that we've cut it out, we can see just how bad it is. This is in quite a bad state, but not as bad a state as our second example. Now, if Beetle owners did the regular checks that I suggested earlier in the video, then their motor cars wouldn't get this bad. And this really is a very sorry state for a motor car to be in. With so much rot at the back there, we don't know where to begin. But start by removing the rear wheel and also the shock absorber. Do use plenty of release oil. And start to remove the strengthening plate on the inner wing. And you'll have to work away at it until it comes free. Also on the inside as well, this will also have to be cut through. Now, to cut any further back than this fold here, you will be cutting into the engine compartment. So with an angle grinder, cut right into the groove. You will also have to cut through the web underneath. And remove the whole section. We can see what a state it's in. It really has gone too bad. All these little pieces will have to be broken off. There's another piece here. Now we have a choice as to whether to fit the full-size panel, the rust being so bad. But the full-size panel doesn't have the strengthening plate and it doesn't have the wing fixing nuts. So we've decided to go for the two smaller panels and make up with a piece afterwards. And after offering up the side panel, we can see the size and assess the shape of the panel that we need for the infill. And it goes without saying, do offer up the panel and draw a line around it and cut away any of the old crust. And cut to say within ½ an inch of your line. This should give you plenty of spare metal to weld to. And clean off all the frilly bits round the parcel shelf. Before you fit the panel, make sure that the collar that goes between the silent bushes fits the panel. Very often these holes have to be filed much bigger. Before fitting the panel for the final time, do clean off any rust and underseal and coat it with a good quality primer or calcium plumbate. Offer the panel into place. Make sure that it's sitting down all correctly. Put back in the 2 rubber washers, one above and one below the support bracket, and line them up with the steel collar. Before putting the bolt in, do give it a generous coating of copper slip. And tighten it down with a spanner. Now before welding, and because we're working on the passenger side, which is the side that the cables run along, do tease out the soundproofing in the engine compartment. Make sure none of the cables are resting against the bodywork. Then tack weld the corners of the panel to the bodywork. And in between lay down a series of good strong tack welds. So you'll end up with something like this for the moment. Now tack weld in the parcel shelf. The turn-up plans on the parcel shelf may require some slight manipulation before you tack weld them in. Now tack weld the upper wheel arch. And then when you're happy everything is in place, go round and weld it fully. And when you fill in the gaps, fill in alternate spaces. This way you will dissipate the heat from the arc and prevent the panels from warping. When it comes to the wing fixing area, and we can see this one is pretty bad, 2 things have to be done first. First you have to pull through the wiring loom, either into the engine compartment or into the cabin compartment. Second, using a straight edge, draw a line on the bodywork straight through the wing fixing nuts, and then that way you can use these lines as a gauge for when you offer up the new panel. Then, using the dirt line caused by the wing rubber seal, cut away this section. And cut off the top section and the bottom section, taking away all the rust. When you get towards the top of the wing, you will encounter this polystyrene foam, which is a soundproof material. Now do try to remove as much of this as you possibly can. It is a fire hazard and will give off toxic fumes if it burns. It's also a water trap. So remove as much as you possibly can. And cut away the rest of the section with rust on it until it's nice and neat. Then this bottom section, tap upwards. Make sure that the 2 edges are nice and neat and free of as much rust as you possibly can get off. Then, using some sticky tape at the end of the cut section, you could use this as a gauge. Offer up the new panel using a wing fixing bolt for location. Make a mark at the junction between the sticky tape and the new panel. The line at the top part of the panel wants to be correct, but the line at the bottom section wants to be half an inch longer. Now cut off the excess. Offer in the new panel by sliding it underneath the top section and overlapping the bottom section, as in our diagram. Having made sure that it's in place, then measure between the wing fixing bolts and make sure you get that exact. If you try to measure the holes middle to middle, that's guesswork. But if you measure the holes front side to front side, that is exact. And it goes without saying, do paint and preserve the existing bodywork. And before you start welding this high up the panel, then do tease back the roof lining and stick it back with some sticky tape. And also do remove as much of this mastic put on by the manufacturers, because of course if this catches fire it gives off toxic fumes. Now offer up the panel again, making sure that everything fits in neatly. And weld this panel in with two good tack welds, one at the top and one at the bottom. And remeasure the bolt holes again. But of course the best thing to do is to offer up the old wing. And this really is the best way to make sure that everything is perfect. It only takes a few minutes to put on and take off again. Then go all round this panel, putting in a series of tack welds round about 2 inches apart, and to avoid warping the metal, fill in the spaces with the alternate spacing method that we demonstrated to you earlier in the video. And then go round with the angle grinder, grinding off all the high spots on the weld bead. This of course may take a little time, and a great deal of care is necessary when doing this job, that you don't go too far or too much and take away all the strength from the weld. When it comes to fitting the side panel, there are 3 methods for fitting this side panel, and we're going to show you them first before we decide what to do with this particular motor car. First of all, you'll have to offer it up to make sure that it's the correct panel. Second, you'll have to consider the running board fixing nut. Now, if the one on your particular motor car is in good condition, then chisel this nut off with a chisel and a hammer as demonstrated earlier in the video. But if the one on your motor car is not in good condition, then you'll have to punch out the original one, and that also was demonstrated. But if you decide to retain the one on your motor car, Then screw in a bolt, and this will act as a good location for the panel. Thirdly, you'll have to consider the lower flange of this panel. A great many people have a tendency to cut this off, but I for one like to leave it in place because it acts as a strengthener for the jacking point. Now draw a line along the top edge of the panel. Now lower the panel about 3/8 of an inch and draw a second line. This is the line that you will cut at. The lower one of the two. On the top edge of the panel there is this fold. You will then tuck this underneath the original panel and weld it as a combination weld. And I've designated this method with a letter A. But if you didn't want to use the whole panel because it's not necessary, then you can draw a line at virtually anywhere along this side panel. Then measure and mark and cut the replacement panel. And when you've offered up this panel, it can be welded in two methods, method B, which is a lap weld, and method C, which is a butt weld. And we've decided to go for method A, so cut the panel out using gilboes or an angle grinder, because of course a bolster chisel's a bit brutal for this panel. Cut right to the door jamb, leaving about 1/2 inch of the side panel left to give you something to weld to. Then using two hammers, one large one as an anvil, panel beat flat any deformity that you may have. And of course with a wire brush clean off any loose rust. And don't forget to paint and preserve the existing bodywork. On later models you may find that the panel doesn't quite sit down perfectly in the door jamb at this point here. So this particular panel will require some metal planishing to reform it into the door jamb. But if the door jamb is in good condition as on this example, then you could cut off the excess material. The side panel will have to be cut at this point and the lower section bent inwards to accept the flange of the new panel and make it a nice neat fit. And start by welding the lower flanges to the sill. Weld at each end first, and then in the middle a short lap weld, and fill in between. The upper weld will be a combination weld. Weld at one end and then at the other. In the middle, and in between, laying down a series of good tack welds. Now you may get slight bulges which you can push in with the handle of a hammer, or as we're using, the handle of a wire brush, and press the two pieces of metal together while you're welding. And when you do the inside tack welds, try to weld in between the outside tack welds as in our diagram. In the wing fixing area there may be some slight metal manipulation required before welding. On the door pillar as well, there also may be some slight manipulation required prior to welding. Now check that the door closes nicely and the panel is fitting well. And that's absolutely perfect. Now we can see the size of the makeup piece required for the inner wing. But on the inside it looks like more than 2 or 3 panels will be required. These can be made up of DIY panels. First with the lower panel which fills in the end of the sill, then with a second panel which fills in the inner wing, and finally with a third panel that we've seen fitted earlier in the video. And it goes without saying, don't forget to paint and preserve your new panels. And finally, in this rear wing area you'll have to refit the shock absorbers. Give the bolt a generous coating of copper slip, so if at any time you have to replace the shock absorber, this nut of course will not seize on and you'll find it quite easy to take off again. And now onto this front inner wing panel with the bumper bar mounting brackets, and we can see there's a great many problems here. And on the opposite side as well, a great many problems. So cut away all the rust and do offer in the new panel to make sure it's the correct one for your motorcar. And before you weld it on, do have a check round to make sure that there's no other problems. You may require little makeup piece in there, and weld that in first. And clean off the rust on this flange area and offer in the new panel. Make sure that the metal meets all the way around and everything's lined up correctly. And the easiest way to do that is to offer up the old wing and screw in about half the fixing bolts. It only takes a few minutes to put on and take off again. Now scratch round the panel with a sharp implement to give you a line whereby you can scrape away the underseal prior to welding. And having welded it on, paint and preserve the weld. And this inner wing panel, it goes without saying, do make sure you've got the right one, and paint and preserve the existing bodywork and the welding bead afterwards. And when it comes to doing work on the head frame, which is on the Super Beetle, we wouldn't recommend you do any more than just put on simple patches. We wouldn't recommend that you fitted the complete head frame. Leave that to the professionals. This has to be jigged up before fitting and welding. If the dedicated amateur tries to do it himself, he'll find all sorts of problems with the steering geometry of the vehicle. This head plate on standard Beetle is also in a bad condition, and this is another one that we wouldn't recommend to the dedicated amateur unless he has an enormous amount of equipment. But do make a check of the front suspension and the torsion bars. This one we can see has a large hole in there, and that's being caused by condensation getting into the bracket. And on the bottom here there is a drain hole, which next time you do your biannual check, do use a small screwdriver and clean it out. Make sure that these are always clear. And the hole on the side there can be repaired with a simple patch. Do paint and preserve it afterwards. And when you're checking over your vehicle, do have a look for these corner plates. These are fairly common to repair. First of all, do break the weld at this point. And that can be replaced by a simple DIY panel. Now on this vehicle we can see there's a section of the engine compartment completely missing. Now this plate that's on here, although it's not structural, is extremely important because it prevents hot air from beneath the engine coming into the top part of the engine compartment and recirculating. This will cause your engine to overheat. So it's important that we put this back. I have to admit, this is the first time I've had to replace this particular panel in its entirety. So it's going to be a new one for me as well. And this is one of those panels that unfortunately you can't buy off the shelf. So, having taken a few measurements, it's time to mark out a piece of cardboard to make a template. And of course we can cut that out and bend it into shape. And that's beginning to look quite neat. And do offer the template into place to make sure it's a good fit before transferring the shape to metal. And that's sitting down quite nicely. Now we're going to show you this in its entirety, but at high speed, so that if you get a panel that we haven't shown on the video, at least you'll know the principles of what to do and how to do it correctly. Whenever you cut metal, do use gloves. Mark out bends with dotted lines. When you hammer, always hammer from one end to the other and back again in a wave action. When you do curves, do cut the curve prior to bending and the shape will turn out quite nice. Do keep the paper template handy so that you know with these multifolds which way to bend the metal. And here's the final bend going into place. Do paint and preserve the back of the panels prior to welding onto the vehicle. This will help to prevent rust from getting in there and rotting these new panels away very, very quickly. It'll be a long time before you have to do this particular panel again, or any others that you have to do. And as I said at the beginning of this chapter, nothing vexes me more than having to replace a panel that was only replaced a couple of years before. And of course, before welding the panel in, do cut out as much of the rust as you possibly can. And of course, do paint the existing bodywork before welding the new panel in. and weld the new panel in using a series of tack welds to start off with before filling in all the way round. And paint and preserve the new bodywork and new panels afterwards. Now, when I ask the question, are you getting cold feet, I don't mean to ask, are you losing courage? But in the literal sense, are you getting cold feet? Well, having replaced all the sills and all the pipework to the heaters and demisters, then have a look at the heat exchangers. And before you and I get into an argument about heat exchangers being part of the bodywork, let me give you a few details. The original ones fitted by the German manufacturers were very, very efficient, and to replace them with original ones will cost you about £80. You can, of course, get cheaper ones, which are usually made in Brazil or Mexico. And the question is, who wants heat in Brazil or Mexico? And the way to tell the difference between the two heaters is to compare the weight. This is quite heavy at about 13.5 pounds, and this one is quite light at around 9 pounds. And another way you can check is by looking in the air intake holes and counting how many fins there are. Now, on the German originals there were 16 fins, and on cheaper ones made in Brazil or Mexico there were only 10 fins, and on some of the very cheap ones there are only 6 fins. And when you buy one of these you think you're getting a bargain when you're not. And on this particular example we can see that the stub that supports the lever which opens the heater flaps has broken off. It also has quite a large hole in the side, and that can be repaired with a simple patch. It also has a small hole in the exhaust pipe stub at the back here, and that too can be repaired. So get yourself a wing washer and a bolt round about 1/4 inch diameter. Put on the lever for location. Make sure it's all central and all lined up, and weld it into place using first of all a couple of good tack welds to locate everything in place. Do make sure that everything is still central and lined up. Weld it into place securely. The lever can now be fitted, and screw a nut on there and saw off excess bolt. When it comes to the patch on the side, a simple patch can be cut out and welded into place. Put on again a couple of good tack welds to locate it. Some slight manipulation may be required during your fitting of this patch. And then weld it up all the way round. The tailpipe stub can be sawn off, and when you saw it off, do endeavour to saw it off at a 90-degree angle. And to replace that section, get yourself a piece of inch steam pipe or inch scaffolding pole and saw it off at about 2 inches long. Again, do cut it at 90 degrees. These simple repairs will save you a great deal of money, and very often they'll save you time as well, because you've got to go out and buy a new heat exchanger, and they really only take just a few minutes to repair. Although this video has taken nearly 15 months to film and prepare, and you can check that next time you see the video by how many haircuts I've had, we unfortunately have not had in any floor pan repairs to do. But the principles are the same. Do clean off all the rust that you can, and do paint and preserve the original floor pan for quite a big area before welding in your new plates or new panels. And of course, paint and preserve them afterwards. Don't just rub on a lick of underseal, shall we say. But working on the premise that prevention is better than cure, next time you do your biannual checks of the car as we've recommended, then here's what to do and what to look for. Next time you tease back the carpets and look underneath and you find moisture, as on this particular example, you'll have to find out where that's coming in. Look out for this brown stain on the carpet, which is rust. So peel back the carpet and have a look underneath. Now I know we can see a hole there, but I don't think that's where the water's coming in. The floor pan seal looks in good condition as well, so it's not there either. On the other side, when we tease back the carpets, we can see a line of rust at this point here. So the first place to investigate is the rubber underneath the bonnet, and on this one we can see that there are 3 rubber points. Now these 3 rubber points go into 3 small holes in the bodywork, but these 3 points seem to be intact, so we can push them back into the holes. But if they've broken off, then glue this rubber back with some impact adhesive. If those holes are left wide open, then the water will run down the inside of the door pillar. The next place to investigate is the rubber seal here at this point. Now if you can see traces of moisture, it could be that the seal between the glass and the rubber has gone. If there isn't any, then it could be the seal between the rubber and the body that's gone. Either way, the outlet for that water is down through the heater vent. And now we're going to ask you to have a little bit of courage, because you'll have to think in terms of pushing out the window. Do remove the front wiper blades and arms before you do this job. So get yourself sitting comfortably and have a piece of cardboard as a pressure displacement pad. Get the sole of your foot against it and press very hard. Sometimes you have to tease back the rubber in the corner to get it started, but very often these are so tight you may need 2 feet to do it. And there it goes. And of course do have somebody on the outside to prevent the glass from sliding down the bonnet and breaking on the front bumper bar. Now do examine the corner of the windscreen frame and you will see 2 small holes. These are drain holes put in by the manufacturers, and they are very efficient. So the easiest thing to do with those is cover them over with insulation tape. But very often there's a different shaped hole with a different story to tell, and this hole will have to be filled in with filler. Now strip off the rubber and give it a good wash in very hot soapy water. Scrub all the grooves to clean out any grit, and by using hot water you'll make the rubber nice and flexible for when you refit it into the windscreen frame. Now give the rubber a liberal coating of grease or liquid soap. I prefer grease because of course it does last a little bit longer than liquid soap. Work the grease into the grooves, that's the glass groove and the body groove, and really get it worked in there well. Refit the rubber onto the glass again and take round a thin string, pulling it into the body groove. Now do go round twice, and that will give the amateur a second bite of the cherry. If you miss a bit on the second turn round, it will pull it through. And make sure when you get to the end that the two pieces of string don't cross over. Now offer in the glass and the rubber together. Do throw the strings onto the inside and endeavour to get the rubber seal started onto the roof side of the frame. Make sure that it's all square and all lined up, and that you haven't got the strings caught over the posts for the wiper blades. When you put it in, make sure it's central, side to side. When you pull the string, always pull towards the middle of the windscreen, no matter what angle you're working at. Always pull towards the middle of the windscreen, and the rubber will soon pop in. Now by now you will have gathered we're coming towards the end of the video, and in this chapter, Top Tips, I'm going to give you some useful hints. Now these useful hints are not here to fill in the video time. My colleague did offer to juggle 2 heat exchangers with an exhaust system. Very amusing, but that's not the point. The point of these tips is to help you get along better with your Beetle, and also to help protect you from any danger. The last thing that I want is for you to end up as a headline in the paper. So if you are going beneath your vehicle, do use equipment of a good standard. Use wheel ramps or axle stands. And the best place to put an axle stand is not actually under the axle, but under the torsion bar on the Beetle. And if you're on a tarmac surface, then do put the axle stand on a piece of plywood. It saves the legs damaging the tarmac surface. If it's a warm day, of course, it becomes unsafe. Now if you're going to be cutting out old metal or even new steel or welding, do use strong gloves. The gloves will protect you from getting cuts and grazes and burns. Don't, whatever you do, try welding without a mask, even to do tack welds. It may not hurt the eyes when you do it, but they'll certainly hurt later. And whenever you grind metal, always wear eye protection. Now if for any reason you have to take off the bonnet, a good tip is these arms here, always have them in the up position. At best they'll give you a nasty shock, or at worst will cause injury. So do have these in the upright position, or tie them down with a piece of string. Now you may not be used to all this stooping, so every so often during your day, stretch up and lean backwards. Do be very careful when you do this, and this will help to straighten the backbone and prevent you from getting backache the next morning. And whenever you put a bolt back into the car, no matter where, always give it a generous coating of copper slip or anti-seize assembly compound, and especially on wheel nuts and bolts. So next time you've got a flat tyre out in the wilds, at least you won't be the one that's jumping up and down shouting, "My kingdom for a longer wheel brace." And always remove fire hazards from the car before welding. Always wear a breathing mask, especially if you're going to be flatting body fillers. A great many of these are asbestos based, and at best they'll give you a sore throat, at worst they are carcinogenic. And we shall be talking about body fillers in the next chapter. Now I'm afraid we haven't got time in this video to talk about spraying, but you can save yourself quite a lot of money by doing the preparation work yourself. And that involves fillers. So I'm going to talk about fillers and filling and how to do it correctly. And there are on the market a wide variety of fillers and pastes that you can use. A great many manufacturers make them under different names. And also the tools that you require. These on the bench, a great many of them are handmade, as you can see. The only thing that's not on the bench are sanding discs. And if you have to use sanding discs, I always consider that as being a bit of a mistake, inasmuch as you've put on too much filler to start with. And this first one, which is handmade, I use for large areas. This is a bought one with sticky pads on, and this is another homemade one, just a piece of wood with some soft rubber on, another one with soft rubber on, and a spatula and a straight edge. Now a useful straight edge, if you haven't got one of these, is the back of a hacksaw blade. As for materials, you'll require some emery cloth and wet and dry paper. This one is a grey silicate coated. This one is an emery, wet and dry, and you can use that, as we say, wet and dry, and a couple of pieces of different grades of emery cloth, coarse and fine. You will also need fillers, and there are two sorts of those. And if you're ever filing off or flatting off fillers, always use a face mask. And do wear one of these, because that will prevent you from inhaling the dust and giving you a sore throat. Now there are a great many brand names on the market today, and two sorts. This one that I'm spreading here is a paste, and it is silky smooth, and it's used as a surface filler. The second one that we can see here is resin with glass fibre in it, and it's used as a base filler for deep recesses. And both of these require an activator, or hardener as it's sometimes called. Now the amateur has a tendency to mix far too much activator into the resin. It really only requires about 2% to send the paste hard, but it needs to be mixed in thoroughly. And the amateur has a tendency to mix up more than he requires. Which usually means that a great chunk of it is left behind and wasted. Now a great many youngsters do come along to me and ask, what can you do with the holes when you're doing a cal custom? And for us old folks, cal customizing is the removal of any chrome and bright metalwork. What do you do with the holes that remain in the bodywork, especially the ones in the doors? After a few weeks, the filler plugs have fallen out, marring what was an expensive respray. Well, here's a simple tip. Take a centre punch and pop it into the hole and give it a good sharp tap. And that will leave a slight dimple. And into the hole put a pop rivet. And that'll leave a good base for the filler. And then you can cover it over with some filler. Don't put on more than you need, and smooth it off. And then it can be smoothed off with some fine emery or coarse wet and dry, round about 400 paper. And every now and again do stop and run your fingers over the filler to make sure you're not rubbing off too much. Now on this door we can see quite a big dent. In fact, if we put a straight edge on, we can see it's about 1/4 of an inch deep. And the problem that we have with that area is that the door is double skinned, so we're not going to be able to panel beat that dent out. So the first thing we're going to have to do is drill some holes in the door, round about 1/8 of an inch diameter. And these holes will act as a key for the filler. And drill the holes in the deepest part of the hollow. Now fillers will stick to almost anything except wax and grease, so give the surface a good roughing with coarse emery cloth. Now spread on some glass fibre impregnated resin. Do press it into all the holes that you've drilled and smooth it out. And remove any of the excess with the back of a hacksaw blade. Now all resin-based fillers have a tendency to leave a waxy deposit after they've set, so give the surface a roughing with coarse emery cloth. And to make perfectly sure that you've removed this wax deposit, give it a wipe over with spirit. And then you can cover it over with surface paste. And when you mix up this surface paste, do guesstimate slightly less than you require, and it's quite amazing you'll find out that you've got just enough. Rather than waste it at the end, you can always mix up a small amount more. Spread it over the whole surface, making sure that there are no air bubbles in there. And then you can finish it off with a straight edge. And then you can flat it back using light circular strokes. Wet and dry paper, when it's new, is waterproof, so it has a tendency to dry out. So, rub the surface with a bar of soap, and this will act as a wetting agent. It also acts as a lubricant, and will prevent the grit on the paper from filling up too quickly with debris from the filler. Now you can continue to rub away at the surface until it's smooth. Now, though the surface feels smooth to the hands, the discoloration in there confuses the eye. So a simple tip is to spray this area with a neutral spray. Grey primer is ideal. This will cover up all the shaded areas, and then the eye will be convinced that the area is smooth. When you spray with primer, you have to consider what type of top coat you're going to be using for the final spray. So do use one that's compatible with the top coat. Don't use an oil base if you're going to be using a cellulose top coat. Now I'd like to leave you with this one final warning. Should it be necessary for you to remove the body from the floor pan to do floor pan repairs or body repairs, when you fit your sections in, just tack weld them and refit the sections together, that's the body and the floor pan, to assess the angles and levels and the bolt holes. Over the last 5 or 6 years, I've been to see 4 projects that have gone drastically wrong. 3 of the owners were prepared to do as I told them, the 4th one wasn't. He refitted his floor pan and body together, warping the floor pan to almost impossible angles. This meant that the car was very unstable in dry conditions and impossible to drive in wet conditions. Now, should the dedicated amateur have to remove his body from the floor pan, let me tell you, it takes a great deal of lifting tackle or many hands to do the job. Now, these small sections on the floor pan to body fixing lip can be done quite easily by inserting in either homemade sections or bought sections. But if you're going to be using larger panels, just tack weld them in, refit the body and floor pan together before you weld them in fully. That way everything will line up. And when you've got your motor car in pristine or concourse condition, let me warn you that there are other elements besides wind and weather that are out to get your motor car. So one of the simplest things to do is to fit an immobiliser switch. And an immobiliser switch is very easy to do. Once, of course, that you understand the ignition circuit. Starting with the battery, leading to the ignition switch, and then onto the coil, and then onto the condenser, either inside or outside of the distributor. It then goes through the earth and the body back to the battery, completes the circuit. Thieves get away with your car by looping across the ignition switch. So fit a second switch at this point here. And this small wire that goes between the coil and the distributor is the one to cut. Take into the car's interior 2 long wires. The other end of the wires then can be fitted to a simple toggle switch. Now, it doesn't matter where you sight this toggle switch. It can be under the dashboard or under the seat, hidden away, or even in the centre of the dashboard. But you have to call it something else, like screen washers or rear lights, reversing lights, anything you like, provided that you remember to switch it on before you turn on your ignition. Well, I hope this video has been a great help to you, and it's time for you to get a start on your motor car. Do be careful with everything that you do. Best of luck now. Bye bye.
It's like going back in time. The only flat TV with Ambilight from Philips. You'll never go back to ordinary TV.
However you choose to see the world.